Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the Middle Ages. So, you know the drill. Lights down, blanket up, maybe tea if you're the cozy type. And if you're already horizontal, congratulations. You're doing this right. Because nothing says quality sleep like drifting off while I talk about iron, soot, and the absolute misery of being the medieval version of your neighborhood mechanic. Now blacksmiths, romanticized in movies as sweaty, muscle-bound men who could forge a sword in slow motion while the sparks flew dramatically around them. Reality check, it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't epic. It was mostly hot, smoky, repetitive work that slowly destroyed your lungs, your back, and probably your will to live. If you're picturing a noble knight proudly wielding his shining blade, remember, behind that knight was a coughing blacksmith who probably hadn't seen sunlight in 3 weeks. And fun fact, blacksmiths were technically respected. They were essential because without them, there were no horseshoes, no armor, no farming tools, no nails for your drafty wooden shack. Which sounds like job security, until you realize job security in the year 1200 meant you'd die young, bent double, covered in burns, while your neighbors politely ignored the fact that your face was always black with soot. Let's talk about the working conditions. Blacksmith shops were basically mini infernos. Imagine a tiny wooden building, crammed with a furnace that's glowing like Mount Doom, belching smoke so thick you could chew it. Ventilation? Huh. Medieval architects didn't really do OSHA compliance, so most smiths spent their lives breathing carbon monoxide and ash, like it was a vitamin supplement. If you didn't keel over from heat exhaustion in the summer, you'd freeze in the winter, because yes, the furnace was warm, but the rest of the shop was still just a drafty hut with holes in the walls. And the hours, oh, the hours. Blacksmiths worked dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, because Sunday was your only break. And even that wasn't a guarantee. If some lord wanted his new suit of armor blessed and polished before battle, guess who was hammering away on the Sabbath? Spoiler, it wasn't the knight. Now, you might think, okay, but at least blacksmiths were well paid, right? And the answer is, kind of. They weren't peasants scratching at the dirt for cabbages, but they also weren't rolling in medieval gold. Most smiths made just enough to feed their families and keep the furnace burning. And remember, iron wasn't cheap. You had to source raw materials, which meant dealing with miners and merchants who charged more than a Starbucks latte, except your latte was literally a chunk of ore. But perhaps the most exhausting part of being a blacksmith wasn't the labor, it was the customers. Knights were picky, lords were demanding, and peasants were broke. So you had this perfect trifecta of clientele: the rich, who constantly complained about quality, the middle, who wanted discounts, and the poor, who begged for credit they'd never repay. And if your work failed, let's say the sword snapped in battle, well, congratulations. Your customer might just show up with the broken blade, waving it in your face while reminding you that honor was at stake, which, in the Middle Ages, usually meant your head. And here's another thing. They didn't just make swords. That's the Hollywood edit. Blacksmiths also made plowshares, hinges, nails, locks, buckets, chains, and basically every boring metal object in a medieval village, which meant Yes, you'd spend hours hammering out something thrilling like a hinge. Nothing says hero of the Middle Ages, like putting the finishing touches on a door latch while coughing up soot. But let's float over to the health problems. Because of course there were health problems. Long-term exposure to smoke and ash gave blacksmiths chronic lung issues. Breathing was optional, but difficult. Burns were constant, because grabbing hot iron is just one slip of the tongs away. Eye damage from staring at bright furnaces all day. Standard issue. And let's not forget the glorious soundtrack of hammering on metal day in and day out until your hearing was permanently fried. Earplugs hadn't been invented unless you count stuffing sheep's wool into your head and hoping for the best. And did I mention alcohol? Because naturally, when you're exhausted, sore, half-blind, and coughing up coal dust, the logical solution is beer, and lots of it. Most blacksmiths drank heavily, partly because water wasn't always safe, and partly because alcohol dulled the pain of existing, but it also made them clumsier, which meant more burns, more accidents, and more, let's call them, medieval oopsies. Now, let's talk about apprenticeships. You didn't just wake up one morning and decide to be a blacksmith. You got dumped into it as a teenager, usually by your parents, who saw dollar signs, or at least loaf of bread signs, in sending you off to work under a master. Apprenticeships lasted years. During this time, you got to live in the shop, sleep in the corner, fetch coal, pump the bellows until your arms fell off, and watch your master do all the fun work while you got yelled at. Payment, room, board, and maybe a crust of bread. Training was essentially just long-term hazing. By the time you finally became a journeyman, you were so physically wrecked, you looked about 10 years older than you were. And here's the kicker. Blacksmiths rarely escaped their station. This wasn't a get-rich-quick career. You weren't going to climb the medieval corporate ladder from local smith to CEO of Ironworks Incorporated. No, you worked, you aged, you died, usually in the same smoky little shop where you started. Generational businesses were common. You passed the anvil down to your son, whether he wanted it or not, because nothing screams family tradition like inheriting asthma and a hammer. But here's where it gets kind of ironic. While smiths were struggling, nobles loved to romanticize them. Poems, tales, legends. They painted blacksmiths as mysterious figures of power, shaping swords of destiny, forging weapons fit for kings, which is hilarious, because in reality, those same kings wouldn't be caught dead inside a forge. Too hot, too dirty, too peasanty. But they loved the idea of blacksmiths as these semi-mythical figures, almost like how people today romanticize cottagecore farming without ever having to shovel manure. And if we zoom out for a second, the blacksmith is just one example of how medieval life looked glamorous on the outside, but was actually, well, miserable. Want another? Let's drift into the life of the medieval baker. Sounds cozy, right? Warm bread, cheerful ovens, maybe a jaunty hat. Wrong. Bakers lived in constant fear of punishment for short-weighing their loaves. If the bread was too small, they could be fined, pilloried, or forced to literally eat their own underweight bread in public as a humiliation ritual. And yes, the ovens were also dangerously hot and prone to burning entire city blocks down. So when you're picturing medieval life, think less storybook charm and more backbreaking labor, endless rules, and daily doses of second-hand smoke. But don't worry, we're not done. Because if you think blacksmithing was rough, wait until you hear about the glamorous lives of medieval nobles. Spoiler, they were miserable too, just in a different, silk-lined way. So let's float gently into the world of castles, crowns, and very inbred family trees. So, nobles, the people you probably think had it made, castles, banquets, fancy robes, servants at their beck and call. Basically, the medieval version of influencers, but with more fur cloaks and less skincare routines. Except, here's the thing. Being a noble wasn't the dream job you might imagine. Sure, you had land, you had money, you had power, but you also had obligations, enemies, bad hygiene, and an extended family tree that looked less like a branching oak and more like a tightly wound ball of twine. Let's start with the castles. On screen, castles are these glowing fortresses of grandeur. In real life, they were damp, cold, and smelled vaguely of human waste mixed with wet dog. Stone walls don't exactly scream cozy. In winter, they radiated the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. Fires in the Great Hall helped a little, but your bedroom? Drafty, smoky, and probably crawling with fleas. Forget silk sheets. Most nobles slept under heavy wool blankets, while rats scurried across the floor like unpaid roommates and the food. Yes, nobles ate better than peasants, but better doesn't mean delicious. It meant huge slabs of overcooked meat, bread that was more weapon than loaf, and sauces designed less for taste and more for covering the flavor of meat that had gone suspiciously off. Salt was prized, not for seasoning, but for desperately trying to stop everything from rotting before it hit the table. And sugar, when it did appear, was like eating gravel mixed with honey, because medieval refining techniques weren't exactly Michelin star approved. Banquets sound glamorous until you realize half the guests were drunk. Hygiene was non-existent, and everyone was eating with their hands. Picture the messiest barbecue you've ever been to. Now add live musicians who can't leave until the Lord gets tired, and finish it off with dogs roaming under the tables, hoping for scraps. Congratulations, you've got a medieval feast. But beyond the food and drafty castles, nobles had another constant worry: politics. Every noble family was in some kind of feud, maybe with a neighbor over a strip of land, maybe with a cousin who thought they should be inheriting the title instead of you. Alliances were fragile, betrayals were constant, and marriage was less about romance and more about which cousin should I marry to keep my property safe. Yes, cousin, because inbreeding wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system. Nobles married within their own circle, which was already pretty small. The result? Family trees that folded back on themselves until you could draw them with a single line. If you've ever wondered why portraits of European monarchs show people with oversized jaws, odd eyes, or the general look of someone who just lost a bar fight with genetics, now you know. And speaking of marriage, Noble women had it especially bad. Their main purpose? Produce heirs. Lots of them, and quickly, because infant mortality was brutal. Childbirth was dangerous, often fatal, and there were no epidurals, just prayers and maybe a shot of wine if you were lucky. Noble women were often married off in their teens to much older men, expected to manage a household, birth a small army of children, and keep smiling through it all. Meanwhile, noblemen weren't exactly free spirits either. Sure, they got to hunt, ride, and occasionally lead armies, but their lives were tightly controlled by duty. If you were the eldest son, congratulations, you were stuck inheriting the estate and managing endless feudal obligations. If you were the second son, too bad, you were shoved into the church, whether you liked it or not. If you were the third son, well, enjoy being broke. And of course, there were tournaments, knights jousting for glory, banners waving, crowds cheering. Sounds exciting, until you realized jousting was basically two men charging at each other with sticks while praying not to die from a splinter through the face. Armor was heavy, horses were expensive, and broken bones were almost guaranteed. And yet, nobles loved it, because nothing says, "I'm rich and bored," like risking your life for a shiny trophy. Now let's touch on hygiene, or the lack thereof. Baths existed, yes, but they weren't daily. At best, you might bathe a few times a year. Perfume was your main weapon against body odor, and judging by some accounts, it wasn't very effective. Lice and fleas were constant companions, and dental care? Forget it. Noble smiles were often a nightmare of rotting teeth, which they covered up with elaborate mustaches or just not smiling in portraits. And while we're at it, let's not forget disease. Being a noble didn't protect you from the plague. In fact, your servants, who went into town and came back with all kinds of germs, probably made you more vulnerable. Smallpox, dysentery, tuberculosis. Pick your poison. Nobles might have had access to physicians, but medieval medicine was less science and more, let's balance your humors by bleeding you out. But the cherry on top of noble life, the endless pressure of reputation. Nobles lived in constant fear of dishonor. Lose a battle? Dishonor. Fail to provide heirs? Dishonor. Get caught gossiping about the wrong person at court? Dishonor. The entire system was basically one giant anxiety machine, where everyone pretended they were superior while secretly panicking about losing status. And remember, being noble didn't mean you were safe from your king. Kings had a habit of seizing estates, demanding extra taxes, or just throwing you into prison if you annoyed them. Because absolute monarchy means never having to say you're sorry. So yes, nobles had fancy titles, silk robes, and gold goblets, but they also had cold bedrooms, bad food, inbred family trees, and a constant sense that one wrong move could ruin their lives. It was less luxury lifestyle and more Game of Thrones, but without the dragons to make it interesting. Now, before you start feeling too sorry for the nobles, let's float down a step on the social ladder. Because if they had it rough, the peasants had it, well, unimaginably worse. So tuck in a little deeper, because next we're going to wander into the fields and hovels of medieval peasants, where survival itself was a full-time job. So, peasants, the people who made up, about 90% of the population, which is wild, because when we think of medieval history, we picture kings, queens, knights in shining armor, maybe a monk or two. Meanwhile, the actual backbone of the whole system was an endless sea of people with names like John the Miller or Agnes the cowherd, who lived, worked, and died in obscurity. And life as a peasant, miserable. Not, the Wi-Fi is slow, miserable. More like, I hope I don't starve this winter, and also my roof just caved in again, miserable. Let's start with housing. Picture a one-room hut. The walls are wattle and daub. That's mud mixed with straw, slapped between some wooden stakes. The roof? Thatch. Which sounds charming until you remember thatch is also a 5-star hotel for mice, birds, and insects. Inside, you'd have a dirt floor. No, not dirt-stained. Just dirt. Sometimes sprinkled with straw to make it fancy. Smoke from your fire seeped into everything. Because chimneys weren't standard, you just had a hole in the roof, which meant your hut was always either freezing cold, chokingly smoky, or both. Furniture was minimal. A rough bench, maybe a table if you were lucky. Beds, usually a pile of straw on the floor, shared by the whole family. And yes, that often included livestock, because bringing your chickens and goats inside helped keep them safe from thieves. And hey, they generated a little extra body heat too. Congratulations, you now share a bed with Bessie the cow. Now let's talk about work. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. And when I say work, I mean back-breaking, hand-blistering labor, plowing fields, sowing grain, weeding, harvesting, hauling water, chopping wood. No tractors, no tools, with ergonomic handles, just wooden plows dragged by oxen and sickles that made your hands ache. And when the work was done, you didn't clock out. You went home and kept working, cooking, spinning wool, repairing roofs, tending animals. It was a nonstop grind. And here's the kicker. Peasants didn't even own the land they worked. The Lord did. You were basically renting your life. In exchange for a plot to farm, you owed labor and taxes. The taxes were absurd. A chunk of your harvest went to the Lord. Another chunk went to the church. And if there was a war or a royal wedding, surprise, more taxes. So, even in a good year, you were left with just enough to scrape by. In a bad year, like if the harvest failed, you starved. Food was bleak. Forget meat. That was for the wealthy. Peasants mostly lived on bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Cabbage, onions, beans. Meat showed up maybe on holidays, if you were lucky, and even then, it was often salted or smoked beyond recognition. Malnutrition was common. People were short, thin, and constantly hungry, which is why peasants often looked about 20 years older than they were, because nothing ages you like surviving on cabbage soup and despair. And then there was disease. Remember, you're living with your animals, in a smoky hut, eating food that's half spoiled, drinking water that's definitely questionable. Hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. Baths were rare. Soap was expensive. Most peasants just rinsed off occasionally in a river, which was also where people dumped waste. So, epidemics spread fast. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, you name it. If you survived childhood, congrats. You'd probably still die by 40. Speaking of childhood, don't romanticize medieval peasant kids running free in the fields. From a young age, children were working, fetching water, tending animals, weeding gardens. Play was minimal. School was non-existent. Literacy rates were microscopic. Unless you were very lucky and ended up in a monastery, books were as foreign as spaceships and religion. The church was everywhere. Your life was measured by feast days, fast days, saints' days. The local priest told you when to celebrate, when to repent, when to starve a little extra during Lent. Religion was both comfort and control. It promised peasants a better afterlife. Because let's be honest, the present life wasn't much to brag about. But let's sprinkle in some irony here. While peasants were scraping together enough grain to make bread, they were also expected to fund the church. That meant tithes, 1/10 of your income straight into the offering box. Imagine barely feeding your family and still owing God rent. And if you didn't pay, eternal damnation was the threat, which is a pretty intense collections policy. And of course, peasants were tied to their lords. Literally, serfs, the lowest rung, were legally bound to the land. They couldn't leave without permission. They couldn't marry without permission. They couldn't even grind their grain without using the Lord's mill and paying for the privilege. Imagine needing your landlord's blessing just to bake bread. That was peasant life. Now, leisure. Did peasants ever get a break? Sort of. Feast days and festivals were their version of vacations. Dancing, music, maybe a bit of ale if you could afford it. These were bright spots in otherwise endless toil. But even then, festivals could get rowdy. Drunken brawls, games that ended with broken bones, and the occasional brush with the authorities when things got out of hand. And don't forget the weather. Modern people complain when it rains on a weekend. Medieval peasants lived and died by the weather. Too much rain, crops rotted. Too little rain, crops withered. A harsh winter, you froze and starved. And there was no safety net, no insurance, no food banks. Just you, your family, and the hope that next year wouldn't be worse. So, to sum it up, being a peasant meant endless work, terrible food, poor health, high taxes, and no real freedom. And yet, they endured. Because what choice did they have? Someone had to grow the food, pay the tithes, and keep the system running, while nobles squabbled and kings plotted. Now, before you sink too deep into peasant misery, let's drift sideways into another corner of medieval life that was somehow just as bleak, but in a different way. The clergy. Because if you thought being married to the land was bad, wait until you see what it was like being married to God. So, now we drift from muddy fields and smoky huts into something that, at first glance, might sound peaceful. The monastery, a life of prayer, meditation, copying manuscripts, maybe feeding the poor. Sounds serene, right? Almost spa-like, except, of course, it wasn't. Being a monk or nun in the Middle Ages was a very particular kind of misery. Let's start with the basics. When you entered the church, You gave up everything: family ties, personal wealth, any chance at marriage or children. It was all out. You were married to God, whether you liked it or not, which sounds noble. But keep in mind, many people didn't exactly choose this life. Families sent spare sons to monasteries because land inheritance only went to the eldest. Daughters, especially inconvenient ones who weren't pretty enough for a good marriage alliance, were conveniently parked in convents. So, a lot of monks and nuns weren't exactly there by divine calling. They were there because their parents needed to downsize. And once you were in, life was strict. Monastic rules were relentless. The day was chopped into hours of prayer, work, and study. The bell was your boss, ringing you awake in the middle of the night for vigils, dragging you out of bed before dawn for matins, reminding you at every possible hour that, yes, God was still watching. Sleep deprivation was basically holy policy, because nothing says closer to Christ like stumbling through a Latin chant at 3 a.m., half asleep and hungry. Speaking of hungry, meals were simple, very simple. Bread, beans, maybe some fish if you were lucky. Meat was banned in many orders. Alcohol, on the other hand, was totally fine, because wine and beer were considered safer than water, which meant a lot of monks spent their lives in a perpetual state of mild tipsiness. Imagine chanting psalms with a low-grade buzz. It happened more often than you'd think. And the silence. Many orders enforced vows of silence, or at the very least, long stretches where you weren't allowed to talk. In theory, it promoted reflection. In practice, it probably made everyone a little stir-crazy, because if you've ever lived with a group of people and not been able to complain out loud when Brother Jeffrey steals your turnip ration again, you know the frustration. But monasteries weren't just about prayer. They were also about work, a lot of work. Farming fields, brewing beer, making cheese, copying manuscripts by hand. Ever try writing in tiny, neat script with a quill for 8 hours a day under candlelight? It's as glamorous as it sounds. Which is to say, not glamorous at all. Eyes strained, backs ached, ink smudged, and just when you were almost finished with a manuscript, the candle might drip and ruin everything. Congratulations. Start again. And let's not forget the physical discomforts. Monasteries weren't luxurious. Cells were bare, beds were hard, clothes were rough wool that itched constantly. Heating? Rare. In winter, monks shivered through prayers with the numb fingers. In summer, they baked in heavy robes. Comfort wasn't the point. Suffering was. It was supposed to bring you closer to God. Now, nuns had their own share of restrictions. Convents were essentially locked communities. Once inside, you weren't leaving. At least, not without a good excuse, and probably a scandal. Daily routines mirrored those of monks. Prayer, work, study. Except nuns often had extra domestic duties. Sewing, weaving, teaching girls from noble families. Which sounds wholesome until you realize that most of it was endless, repetitive labor done under the constant eye of superiors. And then there was the darker side. Not every monastery or convent lived up to its holy reputation. Corruption was rampant. Some abbots lived lavishly off donations. Some nuns came from wealthy families and turned convents into social clubs. And scandals? Oh, there were scandals. Forbidden romances, secret children, even violent feuds between rival orders. The Middle Ages weren't exactly short on hypocrisy. But let's float over to the larger role of the church, because it wasn't just monasteries and convents. The church was everywhere. It was the biggest landowner in Europe. It controlled education, law, and frankly, your eternal fate. Priests could deny you the sacraments, which basically meant shutting the gates of heaven in your face. Talk about power. And priests themselves weren't always the paragons of virtue you'd expect. Many lived with unofficial housekeepers who were suspiciously more like wives. Others were more interested in collecting tithes than saving souls. And higher up the ladder, bishops lived like princes, with fine robes, banquets, and political influence, because nothing screams humble servant of Christ like owning 3 palaces and a stable of horses. The irony of it all was that while peasants scraped by, giving 1/10 of their meager harvest to the church, many clerics lived far more comfortably than the people they preached to, which led to resentment, which led, eventually, to reforms and revolts. But in the thick of the medieval world, the church was simply a fact of life. Now, let's touch briefly on relics and pilgrimages, because those were peak medieval weirdness. People believed bones of saints, scraps of clothing, even random bits of wood supposedly from the true cross had miraculous power. Towns competed to collect relics, because relics drew pilgrims, and pilgrims meant money. Entire economies grew around the idea that some finger bone of Saint whoever could heal gout. Was it true? Probably not. Did it matter? Not really. Faith paid the bills. And speaking of pilgrimages, imagine trudging hundreds of miles on foot through rain, mud, and danger just to reach a shrine. For most peasants, this was the only travel they ever did. For nobles, it was a chance to show off piety while also networking with other elites on the road. For everyone else, it was basically the medieval version of all-inclusive travel, except instead of cocktails, you got blistered feet and maybe a glimpse of a shiny relic behind glass. So yes, monasteries, convents, and the broader church offered structure, meaning, and a promise of salvation, but they also offered boredom, hypocrisy, corruption, and a lot of itchy wool robes. And now, having wandered through smoky smithies, cold castles, muddy fields, and drafty cloisters, it's time we peek at another corner of medieval life that was, well, uniquely awful in its own right. Because if you thought being a peasant or monk was rough, try being a medieval doctor. Spoiler, it wasn't good for them or for their patients. And finally, the night closes gently. You lie back, letting the day dissolve like mist, while the soft flicker of candlelight fades into the shadows. The sounds grow distant, replaced by a calming stillness that wraps around you like a warm cloak. Soon, only the rhythm of your breath remains, steady and peaceful, guiding you deeper into rest. Good night, and may your dreams be kind.